Imagine a civilization that hasn't known war for 3,000 years. Their entire culture resolves conflicts through meditation and discussion. Now picture a brutal invasion fleet appearing in their skies, giving them 1 hour to surrender or be destroyed. This is the story of Centauri Prime's desperate cry for help, and why Earth's response would shock both sides. Centauri Prime's civilization achieved what others considered impossible. For 30 centuries, they maintained absolute peace. Their society resolved disagreements through structured meditation and consensus-based dialogue. No standing army existed. No weapons were manufactured. Disputes moved through councils of elders, not courts of law. The planet itself reflected this harmony. Crystalline towers caught sunlight, scattering prismatic colors across walkways and gardens. Public spaces featured flowing water and resonant chambers designed to promote calm. Technology served art and community, not defense. Their orbital sensors watched for comets and solar flares, not warships. Then the Korak Empire arrived. Their vessels dropped from jump space without warning. Dark angular shapes blotted out the sun across 3 continents. The Centauri monitoring stations registered the intrusions as system errors at first. They had no threat assessment protocols for hostile contact. War Commander Thexel's fleet took orbital positions with cold efficiency. Shield generators on the surface were minimal, designed for meteor deflection. They burned away under focused plasma fire. The first kinetic strikes hit population centers within minutes. Transport hubs dissolved into fire and shattered crystal. The Centauri had no concept of intentional violence. Their language lacked words for invasion or conquest. Elders gathered in meditation chambers trying to understand the attack as a form of extreme communicative breakdown. They attempted to hail the newcomers with messages of welcome. They received weapons fire in response. Civil defense consisted of evacuation protocols for natural disasters. There were no bunkers, no panic rooms, no contingency for orbital bombardment. Citizens moved toward designated shelters assuming this was some terrible accident. They did not run. They did not scream. They moved with orderly confusion as during a planetary drill. Within hours, entire districts lay in ruins. The crystalline architecture that symbolized their peace became shrapnel. Rainbow light refracted through clouds of dust and smoke. The Centauri leadership finally recognized the reality. This was not a misunderstanding. It was extinction. Their culture faced immediate annihilation. Every philosophical tradition, every artistic achievement, every gentle custom, all stood on the brink of erasure. They had no means to retaliate, no means to even effectively hide. Survival required reaching beyond their own capabilities. The planetary chancellor activated the Deep Space Communication Array. It was designed for academic exchange and cultural outreach. Now it would carry a plea for help into the dark, a message aimed at anyone who might value peace enough to fight for it. They began drafting the transmission, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the unfamiliar act of asking for violence on their behalf. War Commander Thexel's face filled every screen on Centauri Prime. His features were sharp, armored, devoid of empathy. He spoke in a guttural language that the planetary translation systems struggled to process. The message was simple, brutal, final. The Centauri had 60 minutes, 1 standard hour to decide the fate of their entire species. The terms were not negotiable: unconditional surrender, complete subjugation, integration into the Korak Empire as a servitor species. Any resistance would result in orbital bombardment until the planet's surface was glass. This was the Korak way. Their strategy relied on psychological shock. They calculated that a short, absolute deadline would paralyze organized defense. Fear would do the work of soldiers. They had used this method across a dozen systems. It always worked. They expected panic. They expected a fractured leadership scrambling for a solution that didn't exist. The Centauri had no military infrastructure to mobilize. No hidden fleet. No planetary shield generator to activate. The Korak fleet outnumbered any potential local defense by 1,000 to 1. The math was simple. The victory was assured. For the Centauri High Council, the hour was a crushing weight. Their entire decision-making process was built around contemplation and consensus. Major policy shifts could take years of discussion. Important philosophical debates stretched across decades. They had no framework for this. Elder Vexandra watched the countdown timer on the main chamber display. The numbers ticked downward with mechanical indifference. Around her, the other council members were silent. Some meditated, seeking clarity. Others simply stared, their minds unable to process the binary choice. Surrender meant the end of their culture. Their children would be raised as slaves. Their art, their music, their history would be erased, deemed irrelevant by their conquerors. Their people would become a resource to be consumed. Fighting meant annihilation. Their cities would be ash. Their population would be reduced to atoms. Every achievement of 3,000 years would vanish from the galaxy as if it never was. Their peaceful ideals offered no third option. There was no meditation technique for combating a fleet of warships. No philosophical argument that could be made to a being like Thexel. His logic was the logic of the predator. The strong consume the weak. It was that simple. The timer reached 30 minutes. Debates began, but they were fractured, desperate. Some argued for a principled stand, a final act of defiance rooted in their belief system. Others advocated for surrender, believing any life was preferable to extinction. No consensus could form. The clock denied them their very way of being. The ultimatum forced a decision they were constitutionally incapable of making. It was a perfect weapon against their culture. It left only one path, a gamble born of absolute desperation. Elder Vexandra made the call. She bypassed the paralyzed council. She gave the order to the communications team. They would not surrender. They would not fight. They would ask for help. They would send a message on the broadest possible band, aimed at the void, hoping that someone, somewhere would answer. The message was composed in moments. A raw, unedited plea. It contained no strategic information, no tactical data, just a simple, desperate cry from a people about to die. They sent it as the timer hit 0. The Zenturi message shot through the void. It bypassed the formal channels of the Galactic Council. Their protocols required evidence, deliberation, committees. They had no time for any of it. The transmission was a raw, unfiltered scream into the dark. It found its way into a deep space monitoring net. A human listening post on the edge of explored territory. The signal was weak, corrupted by interference and distance. The universal translation algorithms flagged it. They parsed the panic and formal grammar. They assembled the words. A voice thin and strained spoke in the operations center. We are under attack by the Korak Empire. Our defenses have failed. We have no means to resist. The transmission cut for a moment. Static hissed. Then the voice returned, weaker. Our people are dying. Our cities burn. Please, if there is anyone out there who values peace and life, help us. There was no strategic data, no list of enemy ship classes or troop strengths, just the sound of a species experiencing violence for the first time. The raw desperation was unmistakable. It was a child's cry in the dark. The transmission ended. The operations officer forwarded it up the chain. It reached Earth's Unified Command Council within minutes. They watched the attached sensor data. Grainy visuals showed Korak warships in low orbit. Energy beams lancing down. Entire sections of a crystalline city vanishing in plumes of fire and debris. A debate began immediately. It was short, brutally pragmatic. The Korak Empire was a known entity, an expansionist power with a significant military. Engaging them meant starting an interstellar war. The logistics were a nightmare. 18 days travel time for the nearest capable fleet. The fuel expenditure alone was staggering. The risk to ships and crews was extreme. The arguments for caution were all logical. The galaxy was a dangerous place. Getting involved in every conflict was unsustainable. The Zenturi were strangers. Their fate was tragic, but not Earth's responsibility. The principle of non-interference had served humanity well. Then they replayed the audio. The voice. The sheer uncomprehending horror in it. It wasn't a soldier's call for backup. It was a plea for salvation from a people who had never needed to ask for anything before. The moral calculus shifted. The cold equations of realpolitik faltered. One admiral broke the silence. He said the decision was simple. They had asked for help. Humanity did not abandon people who asked for help. It was a foundational principle. It was who they were. The order was given. No vote, no further discussion. The Fifth Fleet was placed on immediate deployment readiness. The most powerful deep space force in Earth's arsenal. 12 heavy cruisers, 30 destroyers, a full marine expeditionary force. They would go. The mobilization alerts flashed across the fleet. Crews scrambled from leave. Supply ships began loading munitions and fuel. The intent was no longer observation. It was intervention. They were going to war for a people they had never met. The lead battle group initiated its jump sequence. Their destination was a conflict zone. Their mission was protection. Their motivation was a single desperate cry that had traveled across the stars. The die was cast. The strategic planning room was silent. 9 admirals and 3 civilian oversight ministers watched the holographic display. It showed the Fifth Fleet's projected course. A thin, glowing line stretched 18 days into hostile territory. The fuel consumption figures scrolled beside it. The numbers were sobering. This was not a humanitarian mission. It was a declaration of war. Sending their most powerful force into Korak-controlled space had one outcome: a shooting war with an empire known for its ruthlessness. The logistical cost was staggering. Munitions, reactor fuel, ship maintenance, personnel risk. The bill would be paid for decades. They weighed the cold math. The Zenturi were strangers. Their culture was an abstract concept, a data file. Their destruction was a tragedy, but not an immediate threat to Earth. The principle of non-interference was a cornerstone of galactic policy for a reason. Sticking to your own quadrant kept you alive. But the voice from the transmission lingered. It was not the plea of a government. It was the cry of a people, a species that had never raised a hand in anger, now facing annihilation. The moral argument was simple. They asked for help. You help. There was also strategic calculus. The Korak Empire respected only strength. They preyed on the weak. Allowing them to consume a peaceful civilization unchecked sent a dangerous message. It invited further expansion. It made the galaxy less safe for everyone. A firm response could establish a new precedent. Earth could position itself as a protector, a counterweight to empires built on conquest. This was an opportunity, a chance to draw a line in the interstellar dust, to show that some powers would not stand by while the helpless were devoured. The risk was absolute. The Fifth Fleet was powerful, but it was alone. It would be operating 18 days from the nearest support. The Korak could bring overwhelming force to bear. They dominated through fear and numerical superiority. A single miscalculation could lead to the fleet's destruction. The cost of failure was the loss of Earth's premier strategic asset. It could embolden the Korak. It could invite attacks on human colonies. The stakes could not be higher. This was a gamble with the future security of their own species. Admiral Carter reviewed the data one final time. The fuel estimates, the enemy strength projections, the casualty probability models, they all pointed to one conclusion. The logical choice was to stand down, to mourn the Zenturi from a distance. He looked away from the screens. He thought of the voice on the transmission, the sheer incomprehensible terror in it. The choice was not about logic. It was about identity. It was about what kind of species humanity chose to be in a dark galaxy. He gave the order. The Fifth Fleet would deploy. All 12 heavy cruisers, all 30 destroyers, the entire Marine Expeditionary Force. They would make the 18-day jump. They would enter the combat zone. They would protect the Zenturi. The mobilization order flashed across the fleet. Hatches sealed. Reactors powered to full. Navigation systems locked onto the long, lonely vector to Zenturi space. The ships began to move. One by one, they vanished into the unnatural dark of jump space. The die was cast. The protection had begun. The human shuttle descended through smoky skies. It was a block of armored gray, scarred from previous engagements. It settled on a landing platform of polished crystal, its engines humming with a low, aggressive frequency. The hatch opened. Ambassador Shaw stepped out. His body armor was standard diplomatic issue. It was functional, not decorative. Behind him, a security detail moved with trained precision. Their weapons were held low but ready. Chancellor Vixandra waited. Her robes were simple, woven from a material that caught the fading light. Her aides flanked her. They watched the humans. Their eyes were wide. They did not understand the armor. They did not understand the weapons. The very shape of the shuttle was alien to them. A thing built for conflict, not travel. The cultural divide was immediate. The Zenturi saw tools of violence. The humans saw necessary precautions. Vixandra offered a traditional greeting, a slow bow with open palms. Shaw returned a crisp nod. The contrast was stark. Gentility meeting grim readiness, Shaw spoke first. His voice was calm. He cut through the formalities. He said Earth had heard their call for help. He said they had come to provide it. There were no conditions, no demands for resources or territory. The assistance was a moral obligation. A simple rule: when someone asked for help, you help them. The Zenturiades exchanged uncertain glances. Their entire society was built on intricate systems of reciprocal exchange. A favor for a favor, an offering for an offering. The concept of unconditional aid was philosophically disruptive. It seemed illogical, dangerous. They quietly asked what Earth would want in return, what concessions would be required after the fighting stopped. Shaw shook his head. He explained that humanity's history was not one of perfect peace. They understood hostile situations. They knew the cost of violence. They had learned that some threats could not be meditated away. Some enemies only understood strength. Their presence was not an offer of barter. It was a statement of principle. They protected those who could not protect themselves. Vexandra listened. She watched the human soldiers. She saw how they stood, always scanning, always assessing. Their posture was a language she did not speak. It spoke of constant vigilance, of a world where danger was a baseline condition. She realized these beings operated on a fundamentally different frequency. Their help came from a place of hard experience, not abstract benevolence. The meeting was a collision of two realities. One built on 3,000 years of cultivated peace. The other forged in the fires of perpetual conflict. Neither could fully comprehend the other's worldview. The Zenturi saw the tools of war and feared what they represented. The humans saw a civilization about to be erased and knew only action mattered. The resolution was a fragile understanding. The cultural gap was too wide to bridge in a single conversation. But the immediate threat was a shared fact. Both sides would have to adapt. The Zenturi would have to accept the presence of warriors. The humans would have to navigate the sensitivities of a culture traumatized by violence. The alliance was necessary. It would not be easy. It was a practical arrangement between two species who saw the universe through entirely different lenses. The protection had arrived, and with it, a profound and unsettling new reality. War Commander Thexel reviewed the new intelligence packet. His tactical officers stood in silence. The initial assessment of the human force was wrong. They were not just another species. The file designation was clear. Class 12 Deathworld. Thexel's own homeworld was a harsh Class 7. The difference was not incremental. It was exponential. The report outlined the planetary conditions. Earth's gravity was significantly above galactic standard. Its tectonic plates were in constant, violent flux. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions were not rare disasters. They were regular events. The weather systems were chaotic and extreme. Hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards. The atmosphere itself was a turbulent mix of corrosive and reactive gases. The native flora and fauna read like a list of biological weapons. Predators evolved to hunt with overwhelming speed and power. Prey species developed venom spikes and defensive mechanisms of startling lethality. Microbial life was aggressively virulent. A simple scratch could lead to a fatal infection. The entire ecosystem was a perpetual contest for survival, a constant grinding pressure that shaped every living thing. This environment forged a specific kind of being. Resilience was not a trait. It was a baseline requirement. Adaptation was not a skill. It was an instinct. Humans did not merely survive their world. They thrived in its chaos. They built civilizations on fault lines. They sailed ships into the eyes of storms. They treated their planet's inherent dangers as manageable obstacles. The report detailed the psychological impact. Humans developed hypervigilance as a default state. Their perception of threat was calibrated to a different scale. A Korak warrior might see a challenge. A human saw a problem requiring an immediate, often violent solution. Their cognitive processes prioritized rapid assessment and decisive action. Hesitation meant death. On their world, it always had. Their tactical thinking was fundamentally different. They did not fight for glory or territory alone. They fought to eliminate a threat, permanently. Efficiency outweighed honor. Victory mattered more than ceremony. They would use any tool, any environment, any advantage. They were masters of turning adversity into a weapon. This explained their combat effectiveness. The ease with which they adapted to the battlefield, the calm under fire, the relentless aggression. They were not super soldiers. They were a product of their origin, a species honed by a planet that was constantly trying to kill them. Their moral framework was built on this reality. Protection of their group was the highest law. It justified any action. Thexel understood the miscalculation. He had not sent his fleet against a peer military. He had sent it against a force whose very biology was a weapon. Their soldiers were not trained for war. They were born for it. Their entire evolutionary history was a preparation for conflict. They were not invading. They were defending. And on a death world, defense is always total. The tactical projections on his display shifted. The clean lines of anticipated Korak victory dissolved into a mess of contingency and probability. The numerical superiority of his fleet suddenly felt less certain. 20-to-1 odds assumed a conventional enemy. These were not conventional opponents. They were predators from a world of predators. They would not break. They would not surrender. They would adapt and counterattack. The battle was no longer a simple conquest. It was a confrontation with a force of nature. The calculations had to change. Every assumption about their behavior, their breaking point, their tactics was now invalid. The humans were not just another species to be crushed. They were the most dangerous thing his empire had ever faced. The fight for Zenturi Prime had just become a very different kind of war. The human fleet tore into real space. The light of the jump points faded, leaving the angular black shapes of their warships against the stars. They did not emerge in a rescue formation. They took up tactical positions. The UES Vindicator led the formation, its armor scarred and its weapons banks active. On the surface, the Zenturi watched their monitors. They had expected white-painted medical frigates. They had hoped for civilian evacuation craft. They saw cruisers designed for fleet engagements. They saw destroyers built for close-in weapons fire. The sight was physically jarring. Their plea for salvation had been answered with a declaration of war. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the command channel. It was calm. He addressed his fleet, his tone that of a man stating simple facts. He reminded them of their purpose. They were not here to conquer territory. They were not here for glory. They were here to protect civilians and prevent a genocide. The mission was clear, defensive, protective, necessary. He articulated the philosophy behind the warships. A purely humanitarian force would be useless. It would be a target. Medical ships could not stop orbital bombardment. Unarmed transports could not interdict fighter squadrons. The best way to save lives was to present a force capable of ending the threat to those lives. The military hardware was not an insult. It was the only viable answer to the Zenturi's cry for help. He stated their dual objectives. The primary mission was the defense and preservation of the Zenturi population. The secondary mission was to establish a precedent, to show the galaxy that Earth would protect species who could not protect themselves. It was a statement of principle backed by overwhelming force. The heavily armored landing craft began their descent. They were not gentle. Their engines roared. Their armored hulls were impervious to small arms fire. They were designed for contested landings. Their very design signaled a grim readiness. They carried not doctors but Marines, not aid supplies but munitions and fortified barricades. It was a visual language of violence, and the Zenturi were forced to learn it. The human approach was one of demonstrated strength. They believed in showing their capability first. A show of force could prevent a fight. It could deter aggression. It could make the enemy reconsider their actions. Understanding and diplomacy could come later, from a position of security, not desperation. They were there to create a safe space for those conversations to even be possible. The immediate effect was a shift in the tactical geometry of the entire system. The Korak fleet, previously orbiting with impunity, now had to adjust. Their vectors changed. Their formations tightened. The human warships interposed themselves between the invaders and the planet. They created a shield, a hard, unyielding barrier. The protection Earth offered was not passive. It was not a hopeful gesture. It was an active, aggressive commitment. It came with a clear and unambiguous message. We are here to protect. We are willing to fight to do it. The choice was now Thexel's. He could test that willingness or he could withdraw. The battlefield had a new, unpredictable variable. The calculation for conquest was no longer simple. The humans had arrived, and with them the very real prospect of a fight they could not easily win. The Korak fleet positioned itself. 230 ships against 12 human heavy cruisers and 30 destroyers. The numbers were stark. A 20-to-1 advantage. The Korak formation was a textbook assault pattern, A solid wall of firepower designed to overwhelm and shatter. They expected a conventional engagement. A stand-up fight they could not lose. War Commander Thexel watched his tactical display. The clean lines of his fleet were reassuring. He had fought this battle a dozen times against other species. They saw the numerical disparity. They calculated the odds. They surrendered, or they broke under the first massed volley. His strategy relied on this psychological effect. Brute force and terror were reliable tools. The human commanders saw the same numbers. They arrived at a different conclusion. A conventional fight was suicide. A direct exchange of fire would see their smaller fleet torn apart in minutes. They could not match the Korak ship for ship. They had to change the mathematics of the battle. They needed to leverage other factors. The human tactical doctrine rejected sentiment. It prized efficiency. Every action was measured against a simple question. Does this increase our chance of mission success? Training was not a formality. It was a force multiplier. It turned small units into disproportionately effective combatants. Aggression was not an emotion. It was a tool, a way to seize the initiative and dictate the terms of the fight. The Korak expected cowering. They expected their opponents to retreat, to form a defensive shell, to try and weather the storm. They did not see that response. The human fleet did not hold its position. It moved. Its ships broke formation. They did not retreat. They advanced on aggressive, unpredictable vectors. They refused to be a static target. The human psychology was a shock. They did not play by the established rules of engagement. The Korak understood warfare as a contest of strength. The humans understood it as a problem to be solved. Their objective was not to win a fair fight. It was to win. The method was irrelevant. If the rules of the game favored the enemy, you changed the game. The resolution was immediate. The human fleet commanders issued new orders. They would not engage the Korak main battle line. They would not try to match their firepower. They would use speed. They would use the local environment. They would use misdirection. They would force the Korak to fight on human terms. The battle would be one of cunning, not brute strength. This defiance altered the battle's fundamental nature. The Korak's numerical advantage became less absolute. It was a blunt instrument. The human response was a scalpel. They targeted command ships. They disrupted supply lines. They used the gravitational shadow of the planet to mask their movements. They made the vastness of the Korak fleet a liability. It was harder to coordinate. It was slower to react. The transition was a shift in strategy. Unconventional tactics emerged from necessity. The humans began to use the system's asteroid belts. They lured Korak pursuit elements into the dense fields. There, the larger numbers meant confusion. Ships collided. Fire lanes were blocked. The humans used the chaos. They turned the Korak's greatest asset against them. The battle was no longer about who had the most ships. It was about who could think the fastest. The humans were built for that. Korak raiders hit the civilian evacuation route. They moved in from a blind spot. 6 fighter craft. They targeted the slow, unarmed transports. Their objective was terror and disruption. They expected no resistance. They were wrong. Lieutenant Bennett's squad was already moving. He gave a single order, 2 words. They responded. Their training took over. There was no hesitation, no discussion. The human interceptors broke formation. They did not engage directly. They bled speed. They let the Korak pass them. Then they turned. They leveraged the environment. The nearby asteroid belt was a chaotic mess of rock and ice. Bennett's command was precise. Scatter formation. Draw them into the asteroid belt. It was a trap. The humans knew the terrain. They had mapped the gravitational eddies and debris fields. The Korak only saw cover. They followed the retreating human craft into the maze. The raiders were confident. They had the numbers. They had the firepower. Their tactics were simple. Overwhelm with superior force. They did not see the second element of the trap. Lieutenant Sophie Kane's assault team was already in position. They had used the asteroids as cover. They were deployed on several larger rocks. They carried portable missile launchers. They were silent. They were patient. The Korak fighters entered the kill zone. They were focused on the interceptor squad. They did not scan the asteroids. They assumed the rocks were empty. Kane gave the signal. Her team fired. The missiles lanced out from multiple directions. There was no escape vector. The lead Korak raider detonated. Then another. The formation dissolved into panicked confusion. Bennett's pilots turned. They had drawn the enemy in. Now they pressed the attack. They used the debris from the destroyed ships as additional cover. They appeared from behind wreckage. They fired. They vanished. Their movements were efficient, aggressive. They did not waste a single shot. They did not engage in prolonged dogfights. They struck and disengaged. The battle lasted 4 minutes. 6 Korak raiders were destroyed. The human squadron suffered no losses. The civilian convoy continued its escape uninterrupted. The Zenturi observers monitoring the feed were silent. They had never seen violence executed with such cold precision. It was not chaotic. It was methodical. It was a surgical removal of a threat. The Korak command received the battle report. War Commander Thexel reviewed the data. He saw the tactical logs. The human pilots moved with a coordination his own forces could not match. They fought with a viciousness and tactical skill his warriors couldn't match. The engagement was not a fight. It was an annihilation. His confusion was palpable. This was a demonstration of Deathworlder tactical superiority. It was not about bravery. It was about effectiveness. Every movement had purpose. Every weapon had a target. The humans adapted the geometry of the battlefield to their favor. They turned the asteroid belt from an obstacle into a weapon. They used the enemy's aggression against them. The resolution was a stark lesson. The Korak's numerical advantage was meaningless against such efficiency. Their reliance on brute force was a weakness. The humans had redefined the terms of the engagement. They had shown that they would not fight a fair fight. They would win. The defeat forced a reaction. The Korak could not allow this new tactic to stand. They had to regain the initiative. They had to show they could still inflict fear. Thexel issued new orders. The strategy shifted. If they could not win through conventional means, they would escalate. They would introduce terror weapons designed to break civilian morale. They would target the defenseless. The fight was about to enter a darker phase. The Korak ground forces entered the capital. Their armored columns moved down wide boulevards designed for peaceful processions. They expected sparse resistance. They expected terror. They found a city prepared for them. Colonel Walsh stood in the command center. His map showed the urban terrain in 3 dimensions. He did not see civilian infrastructure. He saw a complex network of potential defensive positions. He coordinated the defense from a hardened bunker beneath the main administrative spire. His orders were clear. Protect the civilians. Use the city. Make the enemy pay for every meter. Tell them evacuation is for people who think they're going to lose, he told a Zenturi liaison. His voice was flat. We're not losing. Staff Sergeant Collins executed the plan. His Marines moved through the crystalline structures. They did not see beautiful architecture. They saw firing lanes and choke points. They set up defensive positions with brutal efficiency. They fortified towers. They mined thoroughfares. They created a labyrinth of death. Remember, these alien bastards think they can just walk in here and take whatever they want, he told his squad. Their response was silent. They understood the mission. They were turning a city of art into a fortress of war. Corporal Lee led the assault element. Her team was light and fast. They moved through the upper levels of a residential complex. Their objective was harassment and disruption. They used the complex verticality of the buildings. They appeared on a balcony, fired a rocket, vanished inside. They used the confusion of the urban canyon to their advantage. Speed and surprise were their weapons. The Korak advance slowed. Their armored vehicles were vulnerable in the narrow streets. Their infantry found themselves trapped in kill zones. A plaza became a shooting gallery. A market street became an ambush point. The humans had converted every civilian space into a tactical problem. The environment itself fought back. The Zenturi civilians were sheltered in deep basements and reinforced structures. The human defense was a shield around them. The Marines fought with disciplined aggression. Every move was calculated to draw the Korak away from non-combatants. They did not retreat. They fell back to prepared positions, luring the enemy deeper into the trap. The Korak expected fear. They expected a broken enemy. They encountered determined professional resistance. Their numerical advantage meant less in the confined urban space. Their vehicles could not maneuver. Their lines of communication were cut. The humans knew the terrain. They used it. The resolution was a stalemate. The urban environment had become a decisive advantage for the defenders. The Korak could not advance without suffering catastrophic losses. They held their positions, regrouping for a new strategy. The city was a cage, and they were inside it with a predator. Frustration mounted in the Korak command. Conventional tactics had failed. The humans had turned their strength against them. A new approach was needed, one designed to break not the soldiers but the will of the civilians they protected. The order was given. The rules of engagement were about to be discarded. The terror weapons were authorized for deployment. The battle was entering its most brutal phase. War Commander Thexel authorized the terror package. It was a standard escalation. The order went out. Fear gas canisters launched from Korak positions. Simultaneously, orbital guns targeted key defensive points. The strategy was a pincer. Break the civilian population's will with chemical horror. Shatter the human military positions with concentrated fire. It had worked on every other world. The gas drifted across the city. It was a pale green mist designed to trigger the most primal fear responses in sentient species. It bypassed rational thought. It spoke directly to the hindbrain. For the Zenturi civilians, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. They were a species built for peace. Their nervous systems were sensitive. They had no defense against this artificial terror. They screamed. They fled in blind panic. They clawed at their own skin. Order collapsed into sheer animal terror. The human Marines saw the gas. Their sensors identified the chemical compound. They donned respirators as a matter of procedure. The psychological effect was the real weapon. It failed. The gas washed over their positions. It found no purchase. Their heart rates remained steady. Their hands did not shake. Dr. Lisa Parker monitored the biofeeds from the Marine squads. She saw the flat lines where panic should have been. She turned to a Zenturi medical officer, a Dr. Kinth, who was trembling beside her. She explained the disconnect. It was a fundamental difference in how their species processed threat. For the Zenturi, fear was a debilitating event. For humans, it was data, a signal to be analyzed and acted upon. "Fear is just information," she said, her voice calm over the sound of explosions. "It tells you there's danger so you can deal with it." The contrast was stark. Zenturi civilians writhed on the ground, overwhelmed by primal terror they had no context for. Human Marines continued to return fire, their movements precise and unhindered. The gas was a non-event for them. Staff Sergeant Collins's voice came over the comm. "Good thing we're not most species." The sentiment was shared across the human lines. The weapon was mild compared to the real predators and disasters of their homeworld. Earth's medical response activated. It was not panic. It was procedure. Dr. Parker and her teams moved into the affected zones. They carried hyposprays loaded with a broad-spectrum neurostabilizer. They moved with purpose. They injected the convulsing Zenturi. The antidote worked quickly. The artificial fear receded. Civilians stopped screaming. They looked up, confused, into the faces of calm human medics. The deployment was efficient, methodical. It underscored a profound procedural readiness. The humans had anticipated biochemical warfare. They had prepared for it. They had not just brought soldiers. They had brought an entire support infrastructure designed to counter the specific tools of conquest. The terror tactic did not just fail. It was actively countered. The resolution was a critical intelligence failure for the Korak. Their most reliable weapon was useless. It caused chaos only among the civilians, which the humans were equipped to mitigate. It did nothing to the soldiers. It did not slow their defense. It did not break their will. It was a wasted effort. The transition was forced upon Thexel. His tactical options were narrowing. Conventional assault had failed. Urban warfare had failed. Psychological warfare had failed. Each tool in his arsenal had been met with a specific effective counter. The humans were not just resisting. They were demonstrating a comprehensive superiority in military doctrine. They forced him to adapt. He had to find a new approach, something they would not expect. The battle entered a new phase of desperation. The Korak had to innovate or face a stalemate they could not win. Captain Rodriguez watched the orbital maps. The Korak bombardment continued. Their ships sat in high orbit. They targeted stationary positions on the surface. It was a slow, methodical process of destruction. It was also predictable. Rodriguez saw the pattern. He made the call. He contacted the fleet. His orders were simple. They were going in. The plan was a radical departure from fleet doctrine. Warships were not designed for atmospheric combat. The stress on the hulls was immense. The heat from re-entry could breach containment fields. The maneuver was considered a last resort. A suicidal option. Rodriguez deemed it necessary. The risk was acceptable. The goal was to deprive the Korak of their advantage. Their bombardment systems were designed for stationary targets. They expected to fire on cities from a fixed position. They did not expect to track warships maneuvering in the upper atmosphere. The humans would force them into a dynamic fight, a battle of movement and improvisation, an environment where Earth's forces excelled. The ships began their descent. The UES Vindicator led the way. Its hull glowed red from the friction. The heat shield screamed under the strain. Alerts flashed on the bridge. Structural integrity warnings. Rodriguez ignored them. He kept his eyes on the tactical display. The Korak fleet was reacting. Their formations were breaking. They were confused. They were not prepared for this. Lieutenant Elena Martinez led a scout squadron. Her fighters dove into the atmosphere behind the cruisers. Her mission was reconnaissance. She had to find the Korak command ship. She flew through an active battle zone. Energy beams lanced past her cockpit. Missiles detonated in the thick air. Her experience flying in Earth's violent weather was an advantage. She navigated the turbulence and fire with calm precision. She was hunting. The gamble was a statement of commitment. It showed the Zenturi that Earth was not just assisting. They were invested. They were risking their most valuable assets to protect them. The civilians on the surface saw the human ships enter the fight. They saw the glowing shapes in the sky engaging the enemy directly. Their capital was being defended. Not abandoned. The atmospheric combat began. The human ships used the planet's weather systems. They flew through cloud banks. They used thermal layers to mask their signatures. They turned the chaotic environment into a weapon. The Korak could not get a target lock. Their firing solutions were useless. They were forced to engage on human terms. A fast, close-range fight they were not prepared for. The resolution was a demonstration of supreme adaptability. The humans had turned a defensive maneuver into an offensive one. They had taken a massive risk and made it work. They had proven that no environment was off limits. No tactic was too unconventional if it achieved the mission. The battle shifted decisively. The Korak were on the defensive. Their orbital dominance was broken. Their command ship was now vulnerable. Martinez had located it. She transmitted the coordinates. The fight was no longer about holding the city. It was about ending the threat. The confrontation moved to its final decisive phase. The humans had the initiative. They intended to keep it. Sergeant Santos and her Marines breached the Korak flagship's hull. The docking clamps held. The airlock cycled. They entered a wide cargo bay. The space was dimly lit. Alien crates were stacked against the walls. The air smelled of ozone and something metallic. The first Korak security team arrived. They were large. Their armor was heavy. They moved with the confidence of warriors who had never faced a real challenge. The Marines did not hesitate. They did not form a defensive line. They charged. Flash grenades went off. The strobing light disoriented the enemy. The humans used the chaos. They closed the distance. Their training was for close-quarters combat. They fought in pairs. One Marine would draw fire. The other would flank. They moved through the bay with brutal efficiency. The Korak were strong. They were not fast. They were not coordinated. They fell quickly. Santos led the push toward the command bridge. Her squad moved through the ship's corridors. They used breach charges on sealed doors. They cleared rooms with controlled bursts of fire. The Korak soldiers were unprepared for this kind of fighting. They were used to terrorizing civilians. They were not used to a professional military force invading their own ship. The humans turned the corridors into killing grounds. Their advance was relentless. They reached the bridge doors. The final barrier. A shaped charge blew the lock. The door slid open. Santos entered first. Her weapon was up. Her squad fanned out behind her. The bridge was large. Consoles glowed with alien script. War Commander Thexel stood in the center. He was taller than the others. His armor was ornate. He held a ceremonial sword. He was not afraid. He was angry. The remaining bridge crew were subdued. The Marines secured the room. The fight was over. Except for one. Thexel looked at Santos. He did not see a soldier. He saw an animal. He spoke. His voice was a low growl. He said his world was a place where only the strong survive. Strength was everything. Weakness was erased. Conquest was the natural order. Domination through fear was the only law that mattered. Santos kept her weapon trained on him. Her reply was calm. She said Earth was a world that did not cuddle its children. It was a place of real danger, of predators and disasters. It forged a different kind of strength. Not the strength to dominate. The strength to protect, the strength to stand between the helpless and the dark. Their purpose was not conquest. It was defense. The duel was not physical. It was ideological. It was the clash of two opposing views of the universe, one built on fear and consumption, the other built on resilience and protection. Thexel lunged. He was fast for his size. The sword came down. Santos sidestepped. She did not shoot him. She disarmed him with a precise strike to his wrist. The sword clattered to the deck. She did not break his arm. She did not execute him. She showed restraint. The message was clear. This was enforcement, not vengeance. Thexel stood there. His hand was numb. He looked at the humans. They had taken his bridge. They had defeated his guards. They had captured him, and they had not killed him. He understood the calculation. They had won. Further resistance was pointless. He gave the order. His voice was flat. He told his fleet to withdraw. The attack on Zenturi Prime was over. The surrender changed everything. The Korak fleet, leaderless and confused, began to break formation. Their coordinated assault dissolved into a disorganized retreat. The strategic balance of the entire battle shifted in an instant. The humans had not just won a fight. They had decapitated the enemy command structure. The invasion force was no longer an organized military. It was a scattered collection of ships. The transition was immediate. The threat was neutralized. The protection was absolute. Admiral Henderson's heavy battle group translated into real space. They did not announce their arrival. They assumed formation. 30 fresh warships. Their hulls were clean. Their weapon arrays glowed with full charge. They moved into position with silent precision. They created a pincer. The Korak fleet was now caught between the new arrivals and Rodriguez's forces in the atmosphere. The trap was set. Earth coordinated the attack across multiple theaters. Fleet Command on the Vindicator directed orbital movements. Colonel Walsh's ground forces maintained pressure in the city. The communication was seamless. No hesitation, no confusion. Each unit understood its role in the larger strategy. The coordination was a product of training and shared doctrine. They fought as a single organism. The application of force was maximum. The human ships did not hold back. They engaged the Korak fleet with concentrated firepower. They targeted engines and command nodes. They avoided fatal blows to life support systems. The goal was disablement, not destruction. The distinction was important. It reflected their protective mandate. They were there to end the threat, not commit genocide. The Korak lines collapsed. Their formation, once a wall of terror, became a scattered mess. Ships tried to break away. They found human destroyers blocking their escape vectors. The coordinated pressure was too much. Their numerical advantage meant nothing against superior tactics and coordination. Their command structure was gone. Their will to fight was broken. They had no answer for this kind of warfare. On the surface, the Zenturi civilians watched their sky. The constant flashes of energy weapons had been a source of dread. Now they saw a change. The Korak ships were moving away. They were retreating. The human ships pursued them. The mood in the shelters shifted. The paralyzing fear began to lift. It was replaced by a cautious, dawning optimism. They were going to survive. Retreat became the only viable option for the invaders. They had lost orbital control. They had lost their commander. They were taking losses from a force they could not effectively engage. The order to withdraw went out across the Korak fleet. It was not a strategic redeployment. It was a full, disorderly retreat. Ships turned and fled toward the system's edge. The invasion was over. Earth's protection had proven itself proactive, not merely reactive. They had not just defended the planet. They had brought sufficient force to decisively end the conflict. They had anticipated the Korak's movements. They had planned for their response. The reinforcement fleet's timing and positioning were perfect. It was a demonstration of strategic foresight and overwhelming commitment. The resolution was a reshaping of the strategic landscape. The Korak Empire had suffered a definitive defeat. Their method of conquest through terror had failed against a species that did not fear them. The message was clear to any who observed. Attacking a civilization under Earth's protection would invite a disproportionate and effective response. It was a powerful deterrent. The immediate threat was neutralized. The Centauri were safe. The cost had been high in resources and risk, but the mission was a success. The war was effectively over. The transition to a new phase began. The reasons behind the Korak's brutal invasion remained a mystery. Their motivation seemed to be simple expansion. But as the dust settled, a different truth would emerge. The retreating invaders carried a secret that would reframe the entire conflict. Their aggression was not born of pure malice. It was born of desperation. Commander Vorak sat in the interrogation room. His armor was gone. His posture was different. The arrogance had bled away. He looked tired. He looked cornered. The human interrogator asked the question, why? Why invade a peaceful world? Why choose conquest? Vorak's answer was not a boast. It was an admission, a confession. He spoke quietly. Our home world is dying. The resources are almost gone and our population is too large. The words hung in the air. It was not a political objective. It was a biological imperative. The Korak Empire was not an engine of malice. It was a lifeboat, a desperate attempt to keep their species from extinction. Their world was a husk. The once rich resource veins were exhausted. The atmosphere processors were failing. The population had grown beyond what the dying planet could sustain. Famine and resource wars had already consumed their society. Conquest was the only solution their leadership could conceive. It was a brutal, terrifying logic. They would take what they needed from those too weak to defend it. Their aggression was not ideology. It was respiration, a gasping breath for a species drowning. Dr. Alex Turner reviewed the transcript. She was an anthropologist attached to the fleet. She saw the pattern. It was a classic failure of imagination, a civilization under extreme pressure collapsing inward. Their cultural trajectory had only one path: take, dominate, consume. They had not considered other options. They had never developed the concept of asking for help. Their entire history was a lesson in solitary survival. Diplomacy was a foreign language. She offered an insight. The Korak could have asked. They could have reached out. Their technology was advanced. Their situation was dire. Other civilizations might have offered aid. Resources could have been shared. Alliances could have been formed. But their cultural programming was rigid. They saw the galaxy as a predatory ecosystem. You were either the hunter or the prey. There was no third option. No possibility of mutual aid. This revelation reframed the entire conflict. The Korak's brutality was not born of pure evil. It was a survival instinct amplified to a galactic scale. Their terror tactics were not for enjoyment. They were a tool. The most efficient method they knew to secure resources with minimal loss of their own forces. They were not monsters. They were a desperate people making monstrous choices. The resolution was a complex moral adjustment. Not all aggression springs from malice. Sometimes it springs from fear. From the primal need to see the next sunrise. This did not excuse their actions. The enslavement of worlds. The destruction of cultures. These were still crimes. But it explained them. It provided a context beyond simple villainy. The transition was a shift in perspective. A new possibility emerged for conflict prevention. Understanding the root cause of aggression was the first step toward its resolution. The problem was not an empire of conquerors. It was a dying world and a terrified population. The solution might not be continued war. It might be addressing the source of the desperation. The battle for Centauri Prime was over. The larger challenge of a galaxy filled with such desperate actors was just beginning. The key to peace might lie not in bigger weapons but in offering a different choice. The battle was over, but the protection continued. Earth did not withdraw its forces. The decision was made at the highest levels. A permanent military presence would remain. The U.S. Vindicator and its escort ships altered their status from expeditionary force to garrison. Their mission shifted from combat to deterrence. They would stay. This was a formal protectorate, a commitment spanning centuries, a diplomatic pivot of immense significance. Earth had abandoned its previous stance of cautious non-interference. It had chosen a side. It had drawn a line around a civilization and declared it under its protection. The implications echoed across known space. Chancellor Vexandra stood on a rebuilt observation platform. She watched the human ships holding position in high orbit. Their dark shapes were a constant reminder. She addressed her reassembled council. Her words were measured. She spoke of a dual truth they had all learned. The galaxy was not a safe place. It contained great evil. Beings like the Korak who would devour the peaceful without a second thought. But it also contained great good. A species that had traveled 18 days into unknown peril. A people who had spent immense resources and risked their own lives. They had asked for nothing in return. They had offered protection rooted in strength. They had become the shield the Zenturi lacked. Earth was credited with more than a military victory. It had offered hope, a tangible alternative to the galaxy's predatory logic. It proved that strength did not have to be used for domination. It could be used for preservation. A civilization built on meditation and art could survive if it had a guardian. The Zenturi Plea had been a catalyst. A single distress signal had not just summoned rescuers. It had forged a transformative alliance. It had forced Earth to define its role on the interstellar stage. The decision to stay was a message to everyone. Attack a peaceful species under our protection, and you attack us. The resolution was a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. A new player had announced itself. Not as an empire seeking territory, but as a power guaranteeing safety. The rules of engagement had changed. Conquest was no longer a simple calculation of local defenses. It now risked inviting a response from a Deathworld military. The Korak Empire received the message. Their intelligence services analyzed the new protectorate status. Their strategic projections changed. An attack on Zenturi Prime was no longer an easy victory. It was a guaranteed war with Earth. Their calculus of risk and reward was permanently altered. The deterrent worked. The transition to a lasting peace began. The aftermath of the war revealed the deep consequences of that single choice to stay. The Zenturi had to adapt to a new reality. Their world was now a fortified point on a star chart. Their safety was guaranteed by the most formidable military in the sector. Their cultural evolution was now tied to an external power. The human presence was a fact of life. Marines patrolled the rebuilt cities. Engineers helped strengthen orbital defenses. Advisors worked with the Zenturi on contingency plans. The gentle civilization was learning the language of security from masters of the craft. The alliance was a shield, but it was also a chain. Their independence was now shared. Their future was irrevocably linked to Earth's. The protection was absolute. The cost was a loss of innocence. The galaxy had forced a choice upon them, and they had chosen survival. Chancellor Vexandra looked at the rebuilt meditation spire. Its crystal surfaces were perfect again. The gardens below were replanted. But the peace was different now. The calm felt manufactured, guarded. She held a council meeting in the new chamber. The topic was defense. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Her peaceful ideals strained against the new reality. Their survival required tools they had never needed. Weapons, armor, tactical planning. The Zenturi had to learn violence to prevent violence. It was a paradox that unsettled their entire philosophical framework. Their ethics valued life. Their practical needs now demanded they train to take it. This was the central dilemma. How does a species built for harmony integrate the concept of combat? Earth's mentorship offered a path. It was not a path of conquest. It was a path of protection. The human advisors were clear. They were not teaching aggression. They were teaching defense. The distinction was critical. It was about creating a shield, not forging a sword. The goal was to make the Zenturi capable of deterring attack, not launching one. The cultural exchange became a two-way stream. The Zenturi shared their deep knowledge of meditation and mental focus. They taught the human soldiers techniques for clarity under pressure, for finding calm in chaos. The humans, in turn, taught tactical defense, urban warfare techniques, how to use their environment, how to create defensive perimeters without sacrificing their city's beauty. Colonel Walsh observed a training session. Zenturi volunteers learned to handle simple sidearms. Their movements were hesitant at first. Their expressions were troubled. He explained the purpose. A weapon was a tool. Its moral value was determined by the hand that held it. In their hands, it was a means of preserving their way of life. It was a last resort to ensure their children could continue to meditate in peace. The reconciliation was a daily struggle. Each new defensive installation was debated. Each weapon system required a philosophical justification. The Zenturi did not embrace these changes easily. They questioned every step. They sought to understand the need for each measure. The process was slow. It was deliberate. They were determined to not lose their soul in the act of saving their civilization. The resolution was an acceptance of difficult choices. Survival in a hostile galaxy sometimes required embracing methods that conflicted with core beliefs. They learned that peace was not a passive state. It was an active condition that required vigilance. It required the strength to defend it. Their innocence was a luxury they could no longer afford. The galaxy watched this unprecedented alliance. Other peaceful species observed the Zenturi's transformation. They saw a civilization navigating the difficult transition from pure pacifism to capable self-defense. They saw Earth's role not as an overlord but as a guide, a protector that taught its charges how to eventually protect themselves. The experiment was being conducted in real time. Its success or failure would influence interstellar relations for generations. The lesson was clear. Isolation was no longer a viable strategy. The only path to lasting peace was through mutual defense and shared strength. The universe had become too dangerous to face alone. The news of the Karak defeat moved through the galaxy. It traveled on diplomatic channels and trade routes. It reached every listening post. The shock was profound. For decades, the Karak Empire had been an unstoppable force. Their expansion was a fact of galactic life. Their defeat was not just a military loss. It was a collapse of an idea. The concept of their inevitability shattered. Earth's status transformed overnight. It ceased to be a quiet observer on the rim of known space. It became a power. The protectorate over Zenturi Prime was a clear statement. It was a line drawn around a peaceful civilization, a declaration that some worlds were under protection. The UES Vindicator's continued presence was the proof. It was a permanent deterrent. A promise backed by warships. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Their previous debates had been academic, theoretical discussions on the ethics of intervention. They had debated the Zenturi crisis for hours while the planet burned. Now they had a case study. They saw the results of decisive action versus bureaucratic delay. The policy of non-intervention was no longer a safe default. It was a choice with measurable consequences. The Council began drafting new protocols for rapid response. New diplomatic channels opened. They were not based on trade or mutual suspicion. They were based on resource sharing and mutual defense. Smaller civilizations, previously isolated and fearful, saw a new model. They could seek protection without surrendering sovereignty. They could form alliances that were not predatory. Earth became a hub for these negotiations. The balance of power shifted from empires built on conquest to networks built on cooperation. The Karak Empire faced internal turmoil. Their strategy was broken. Conquest was no longer a low-risk path to resources. It now invited a response from a Deathworld military. Their intelligence agencies scrambled to reassess the Galactic Board. They had to consider diplomacy. They had to consider treaties. Their entire societal structure, built on the supremacy of the strong, was under threat. They were forced to adapt or face isolation. The Zenturi became a symbol. Their survival was a beacon. They proved that a peaceful species could endure in a dangerous galaxy. They showed that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. It could be the first step toward a powerful alliance. Their world was no longer just a planet. It was a testament to the idea that protection could triumph over predation. The story of the single distress signal became a legend. It was a lesson in cause and effect. A plea sent into the dark had not just summoned rescuers. It had altered the fundamental relationships between stars. It proved that one act of desperation could change the fate of billions. It demonstrated that moral duty, when backed by decisive force, could redefine reality. The shift was comprehensive. Military doctrine changed. Diplomacy changed. The very way civilizations perceived their place in the cosmos changed. The galaxy became a slightly less terrifying place for those who wished to live in peace. It became a more complicated place for those who relied on fear. The immediate conflict was over. The larger story was just beginning. The precedent was set. The rules were rewritten. The protectorate stood as a permanent reminder. The cry for help had been answered. The response had reshaped the galaxy. The consequences would unfold for centuries. The age of unchallenged conquest was over. A new era of guarded peace had begun. The Zenturi cry revealed a universal truth. Peace is not passive. It must be actively defended against those who would shatter it. Their reliance on harmony faltered against a brutal enemy that understood only force. Earth answered that call. The decision was rooted in duty, not conquest. Deploying the Fifth Fleet established a new galactic principle: protect those who cannot protect themselves. This story continues across the stars. The next chapter depends on a simple choice: who asks for help and who is willing to answer. The future is unwritten,